出すわよね。
出すわよ。
この日焼けしたたくましい体。それでいてこの目に宿る現代の兄。物言わぬ乾いた唇。社会不安への憤りを代表し。そして君のこの花は権力への反抗を示して膨らむ。
Today, Japan has a reputation when it comes to their media, namely how bizarre, entertaining, and ahead of its time a lot of it is. Japan were pioneers in the genres of reality TV and live streaming, and of course the enormous popularity of anime for children and adults alike further cements how integral the country is for shaping Western culture. However, I believe that Japan were also pioneers in a genre that I completely made up, feral filmmaking. Feral filmmaking is pretty self-explanatory. It refers to film or television that's completely unhinged and energetic in its editing, cinematography, and overall presentation. I like to think of these feral filmmakers just like feral animals, on the outskirts of society, gnashing their teeth, just begging for people to stay away from them. However, just like the urge to help a poor feral cat out in the cold, is the urge to contemplate and understand films that are equal parts rage, energy, and lunacy. The idea of this video is to explore some of these feral films and try to understand them, or discuss the challenges in trying to understand them. Ultimately, I think what becomes clear in watching these frantic, sometimes unintelligible films is that when given the context that they come in, or the topics they discuss at their core, some of them actually make complete sense. These are intense, visceral reactions to war, violence, industrialism, and urbanism. And that can be expected when frustration has been pent up for so long. I want to track this movement of feral filmmaking with some early and noteworthy examples from Japan and illustrate the development of it over time. Like many things in history, this insane body of work isn't necessarily chronological, as a lot of various artists were making intriguing things at the same time. I'll try to lay the films out on a timeline when I can, but I want to lay them out on a scale, with films becoming more and more unhinged and inaccessible as it goes. Let's try to answer a simple question. What is feral filmmaking? Before we begin actually talking about the films at hand, it's important to contextualize where this microgenre that I made up comes from. Because although calling it feral filmmaking was my catchy way of summarizing it, a lot of professional, well-educated people have documented this era of Japanese cinema. Specifically, its roots in a post-war Japan. As to be expected, war permeates all corners of any culture, from its education to its daily life to its art. So of course, once the dust has settled after World War II, its effects on cinema are inevitable and abundant. While there are various subgenres and classifications of films from this time period of the 50s and 60s, I think the most significant to our discussion, and where early examples of chaotic cinema can be found, is in Sun Tribe films, a controversial Japanese microgenre of the 1950s and 60s, centering on disaffected post-war youth, a definition I found created on IMDb. However, this random user isn't just making things up. Films depicting ravenous, unsatisfied, traumatized youth existing after the war and channeling all that anxiety into their surroundings became a staple of Japanese cinema in the 50s and 60s. One of the main reasons for this, as Dan Gary points out in his paper, Butts, Blood, and Bombs, is the American occupation in Japan during the 1940s. The American occupation affected the film industry when the SCAP, Supreme Commander of Allied Powers, officials reviewed the Japanese film industry. The SCAP started to censor, ban, and burn wartime productions and encourage films on democratic themes such as women's rights and the struggle against militarism, and even insisted that modernization should include kissing scenes, long forbidden by Japanese tradition. So naturally, American culture began to seep into Japanese cinema. One prevailing theme of American cinema at the time also had to do with post-war anxieties. The early to mid-50s gave way to very popular films about rebellious youth, such as The Wild Ones starring Marlon Brando, or the immensely influential Rebel Without a Cause. So considering this influence, and the fact that Japan had also just lived through the same war, Sun Tribe films are a natural reaction to all of this. Sun Tribe films had an anarchistic nature to them that only became progressively more apparent as they went on, and of course inspired the feral films that will be mentioned later in this video. Pinocchio. They went against Japanese ideals of militarism, modesty, and respect. An example of a seminal work in this category would be the novel and then later film Crazed Fruit in 1956. Directed by Ko Nakahira, the film follows two brothers as they compete over the love of a young woman. The film was controversial for the way it showed Japanese youth as gamblers, drinkers, and sexual beings. There were scenes of people smoking and drinking, young people kissing and fondling each other, even scenes of extended moaning in the background. While this seems pretty tame by today's standard, this was very outside the norm for Japanese cinema at the time, and made a stark statement that more or less started the Sun Tribe movement. Of course, tracking every single movie in the Japanese film that fits this category, as well as pinpointing a specific film that started it, is pretty much impossible. There's a lot to be said about Sun Tribe films, post-war cinema, and its influence today. There's a whole list of these types of movies that are influential in their own ways. However, for the sake of beginning to tie the discussion of feral films together, we will start where many people who are into these kinds of intense movies can trace an early influence on their favorite films of the genre. The Warped Ones wasn't exactly on my initial list as I began to compile the films I wanted to talk about here. As I began to delve deeper and find older movies that seemed to have an impact on the filmmakers that went on to make some crazy things, this feels like a good place to start when talking about films that just go completely feral. The film is relatively tame in terms of its presentation, especially compared to other films on this list. However, even if you compare it to Crazed Fruit, you can see where the film carries a different energy. While Crazed Fruit was controversial, it's pretty standard in its presentation, with a relatively still camera. Where the Warped Ones differs is by capturing the general frantic energy that Sun Tribe films were about as well. The camera follows characters in a somewhat erratic way, representing the erratic behavior of the characters in the film, mainly Akira, who the film focuses heavily on. The movie follows this Akira, a juvenile delinquent who's let out of jail and immediately begins wreaking havoc again, seeking revenge on the couple who helped get him put away. The characters in these cases are also meant to represent the larger communities from which they come from, the protagonist representing an angry, underprivileged underground, and the journalist and artist couple as part of a quote-unquote higher part of society. In many ways, the film is about what happens when these two groups of society begin to mix and mingle, which is of course exactly what was happening during the Sun Tribe movement, as ideals of cinema and high art were being thrown out the window for a gritty representation of post-war Japan. Throughout the characters' dialogue, there were also themes of the loss of Japanese culture, anti-nationalism, and focus on the ways in which the characters in the movie constantly abuse and prey on one another. I think the most significant way that this film achieves this chaotic and energetic feeling is through something that will become even more important as we continue this discussion: the music. Most of the film is scored with a thumping jazz that acts just as spontaneous and erratic as the camera and characters. The dialogue references jazz a lot as well, as the characters seem to recognize this energy. In fact, a prevailing theme of the movie is actually, in a way, about Sun Tribe films as a genre, or more broadly, about making and interpreting art about chaos and delinquency. There's an extended scene in which the protagonist visits the art installation of the woman he's been harassing, acting in his patented bizarre way, touching the paintings and moving them around. Later in the film, he visits the art gallery where the woman works and is ogled at by the artists who work there, as one man in particular asks if he can use him as a subject for some art, and how the different parts of his body represent various rebellious ideals. Finally, close to the end of the film, the man returns once again to the gallery, cooking a chicken inside of it and eating it, all while adding strokes to a piece of art in the process. A marked change in this scene is that when he starts the record player, it's playing classical music. This music change is clearly to indicate the duality between something disciplined and formal, like classical, against the chaos and spontaneity of jazz, and how they both represent the different characters in the movie. As the man takes a nap in the art gallery, the couple visit only to find him asleep on the couch. He has assaulted the man and the woman, and has completely ignored the woman's pleas to help her in any way when she realizes that the baby she's carrying is his. So the man and the woman come up with a plan to kill him. They open the gas line he was using to cook the chicken, and leave so that it will look like an accident to the police. However, a sudden burst of energy in the classical music wakes him up and he stumbles out of the gallery. No matter how much the couple, the representation of high art and class, want to eliminate the protagonist, this embodiment of counterculture and low art, they cannot. He'll always continue to torture them, to remind them of the people outside of their society, to remind them that even though they tried to get him thrown in jail, that the energy of youth and rebellion will always prevail. That kind of rhymed. This idea of these cultures having to coexist culminates in a final scene of the film. Earlier in the film, the artist who Akira assaulted asks Akira's prostitute friend to sleep with the journalist so that he can be desecrated as she was. This results in Yuki, the prostitute, becoming pregnant with the journalist's baby. Yuki's own boyfriend agrees to care for the child, but he ends up dying during an attempt to climb the ranks in a gang he's in. So Akira takes Yuki to the hospital to have the baby aborted. While at the hospital, they've run into the young couple, who are there to have an abortion as well, as they try to abort Akira's baby. This leads Akira to come to a conclusion that both of the men should swap places so they can care for each of their own respective children. This realization leads to a somewhat deranged scene in which Akira and Yuki cannot stop laughing. This nervous energy that's been building the whole film breaks once they realize that the high class and low class cultures will never be able to separate. On a thematic level, the intent is clear. The rebellious post-war films of Sun Tribe movement and Japanese new wave cinema as a whole have permeated artistic culture in Japan, and both worlds will have to coexist. Based on the at times chaotic camera work, the important energy of the soundtrack, and just what the film represents as a whole for Japanese cinema, it feels like this is a natural starting point when discussing the idea of feral filmmaking. The characters in the film are feral, more or less, shouting, making weird noises, and baring their teeth to all. What the film tells us is that no matter how hard society may try, this energy cannot be tamed. However, things are about to get a whole lot weirder very quickly. House. What do you even say about House? The next entry in this lineup of feral films takes place a whole 17 years after The Warped Ones is released. At this time, Japanese cinema has undergone some dramatic changes, marked by the ubiquity of television in the 70s. The 70s became a tumultuous time for Japanese cinema, as Tetsuo Sato points out in his book, Currents in Japanese Cinema. In the chapter regarding the 1970s, he writes, "By then, several important genres that had previously been big box office attractions had lost their popularity." He goes on to say that this led to the rise of independent producers, and that people with original ideas could produce and distribute at their own risk. And boy, were some original movies made alright. The one we'll focus on today is called House. House is a complete tonal, aesthetic, and stylistic shift from The Warped Ones, and also from many other films that came before it, and frankly, after it. The film is directed by Nobuhiko Obayashi.
Hello, and I love you.
Who had gotten his start in the 60s directing experimental films. Throughout the 70s, he supposedly directed over 300 commercials for Japan and America, until House in 1977. The film is, well, a horror film technically. The plot follows a group of Japanese schoolgirls with nicknames like Mac, Prof, Melody, Fantasy, Gorgeous, and Kung Fu, traveling to one of the girl's sick aunt's house for a summer vacation, coming face to face with a number of supernatural elements inside her house. That may sound like a pretty generic idea for a movie, but I can assure you, the film is anything but generic. While The Warped Ones has a gritty black and white aesthetic, House is a colorful disaster, shifting from scene to scene of bright, vibrant, and often random and unfathomable imagery. I would call the atmosphere dreamlike, but perhaps nightmare should be a better description. It's worth noting here, as has been noted by other YouTube videos and articles, that Obayashi consulted his 10-year-old daughter to help with capturing these imaginative scenes based on fears and nightmares that she'd had. This childlike quality adds to the disjointed and dreamy atmosphere of the film. The film makes his feral nature clear pretty much from the beginning. Like The Warped Ones, it has an abundant soundtrack that carries the action of the film. A stark difference between the two films, however, is the film's editing choices. The way House is edited feels like opening Windows Movie Maker for the first time and just adding in whatever effects you want. There's animated scene transitions, overlays on top of one another, dramatic zooms and cuts. If there's one way that House ups the ante, it's in using editing to add to the uneasy and unsettling atmosphere of the film. Here's an example. This is one of the first scenes with a lot of quick action. I'm gonna play it and let you try to decipher what you think just happened. In case you didn't catch it, Let me play it again. So, in this scene, a crystal falls from a chandelier and kills a lizard, while one girl jumps out of the way, another screams, and a cat that was sitting on a lady's lap jumps in the air toward the lizard. The first time I watched this sequence, I needed to stop and replay it to try to understand what just happened. Yes, it gets the point across, but it's such an unsettling way that's so unique to this movie. The bizarre music, the screaming, flashing images while the cat's thrown in the air. It's stylized almost to the point of being unfathomable. This is one of the more tame examples, but I think it clearly shows how the editing and style of the movie are unhinged at times. The whole movie isn't like this one scene. There are moments of reprieve, moments to drive the plot forward, in which the editing and camera movements are relatively simple or subdued. But they only serve to make the stylistic moments that much more chaotic. What follows is a series of dramatic death scenes in which the girls are killed one by Gorgeous's aunt and her magical house, all killed in ways relating to their nicknames, like Melody being eaten by a piano. As the girls continue to be picked off one by one, the house becomes more nightmarish and demented, delving further into madness. The movie deals in extremes: extreme editing, extreme music choices, extreme death sequences, and an extreme and colorful visual style. But what is it actually about? Well, trying to look too deeply into this film is a futile effort. Not only is it hard to comprehend, but rather constricting to try to assume or analyze anything in particular that it's about. However, that doesn't mean there's nothing worth analyzing at a deeper level. It's also worth noting that Obayashi himself lived through the bombings of Hiroshima in 1945. Thus, he'd be no stranger to post-war anxieties and fears. It makes sense then that a person who lived through such an unexplainable, chaotic tragedy would make a film that's also unexplainable and chaotic. The film has some clear through lines of femininity and beauty, and coming to grips with that at odds with age. Erin Denoda discusses this in her paper, Breaking the Mirror: Hausu and Bad Love Objects. There's a through line between this film and The Warped Ones in the realm of womanhood and safety during uneasy times after the war. In The Warped Ones, violence against women is normalized to our protagonist, who sexually assaults a woman and then continues to just ignore her, as some sort of representation for hatred towards Japan as a whole. In House, the violence becomes unnormalized, but just as prevalent. Instead of it being just another day, the violence towards the women is sensationalized and cartoonish. In House, the ultimate irony is that another woman, the aunt, is who enacts this violence against the young girls, perhaps in an attempt to reclaim her youth and beauty. This erotic subtext is thoroughly examined in Denoda's paper. While both films take a different approach, the results are similar in expressing the intense pressures of dangers for women during post-war Japan. In trying to link the film with a long line of rebellion and Sun Tribe films, I want to focus more on another observation made in that paper. Denoda says this: many of the film's explicitly horrific sequences borrow techniques from collage art and two-dimensional animation, producing an aesthetic where the girl's bodily obliteration is accompanied by a rejection of Cartesian perspective and orderly composition. While such techniques are certainly associated with 1970s consumer culture and its ties to teen girls, an attention toward depthlessness or to a lack of indexal transparency signifies differently in Japanese cultural politics than it does in Western modernist contexts, particularly since these artistic tendencies typically collate around tradition rather than its collapse. Denoda points to the chaotic whiplash of the death scenes in the film, as they often jump between style and form, sometimes using animation or mixed media in place of live action. She does this to outline how the stark change in presentation parallels changing ideals about Japanese identity, specifically for women at the time. She says that these editing techniques could represent a collapse of tradition felt by Japanese people during this time. I think that this idea about the collapse of tradition is exemplified by the film as a whole, which helps bridge the gap between earlier Sun Tribe films and later films that will continue to illustrate this breaking of tradition, in both their subject matter and their presentation. House relates to previous films which capture the frustrations felt by Japanese people post-war, but also illustrates how the art of cinema could be used to push these ideas even further, capturing this frustration, confusion, and whiplash in the form of the film itself. While there will always be more to say about House, we turn now to the 80s, as one of the icons in feral filmmaking is beginning to release films that will continue in the footsteps of Obayashi. Throughout the 70s and early 80s, other creators were beginning to lean into the same insanity as Obayashi. While he started in the late 70s as well, the next creator I'd like to talk about made a name for himself in the 80s with a patented punk rock style, and that is Gakuru Ishii. Ishii's style really began to come into fruition with some films that he released in the early 80s, like Crazy Thunder Road and Burst City. Both films very much utilized a similar biker punk aesthetic. The former, Crazy Thunder Road, was actually Ishii's graduation project for university. Thus, it was abundantly clear that even as a student, Ishii had an aesthetic in mind. Both Crazy Thunder Road and Burst City demonstrate the underground punk aesthetics of Japan during the 70s and 80s. Burst City is an interesting film in particular because it deviates slightly from the sensibilities of Thunder Road. It's a musical. If this unconventional presentation juxtaposed against the more grimy, DIY aesthetic of punk bikers in Japan sounds weird, well, it is. It's exactly the type of deviation from the norm that the punk scene would appreciate. Somehow, in all the chaos, the numerous POV camera shots from motorcycles, the cheesy cinematography, and rock and roll soundtrack create a kind of organized chaos, a method to the madness. While Ishii's work has never been quote-unquote normal, these earlier films would hint at a brooding madness, a chaotic electric energy that needed to be released, and it would be, nearly 2 decades later. While Ishii's early works are punk and chaotic, it wouldn't be until 2001 that he'd release something that I would describe as feral. Electric Dragon 80,000 Volts is, as you could probably guess by the title, energetic and electric. Coming in at under 60 minutes long, the film carries the punk ethos of a short, concentrated burst of rage. And while it's not a musical like Burst City, music plays a very important role here as well. The film tells a story of a young boy who undergoes electric shock therapy to treat his aggressive behavior growing up, which as an adult gives him immense power to harness electricity and a primal ability to communicate with reptiles. He grows into adulthood using these powers to be a boxer and shred at the electric guitar. It turns out he's not alone. Another man shares these same abilities due to climbing an electric pole and getting shocked as a kid, and is merged with a metallic statue of Buddha, giving him the name Thunderbolt Buddha. Thunderbolt Buddha makes his way through Tokyo, taking out crime bosses and such, but when he hears that somebody else shares his ability, he makes it his goal to destroy him. The film really is as insane as it sounds. It's definitely not a slow burn kind of movie. It does take some time at the beginning to set up the protagonist and his powers, and how he navigates daily life with these abilities. Nowadays, he doesn't receive his powers from shock therapy, but from shocking himself, along with using his electric guitar. This leads into the noise rock and punk soundtrack, which is actually by the band Mach 1.67 that the lead actor Tadanobu Asano played in. The first scenes featuring this crazy electric guitar playing, starting as noise and building into a more recognizable music, is when the form of the film really begins to play with these ideas. The camera movements become a lot more unstable, pulsating with the music. Quick cuts and flashy lighting add to the chaos, and like House, the film uses a mixed media approach at times. Eventually, we learn that Thunderbolt Buddha is becoming figuratively and literally power hungry. He wants more electricity, but he also wants to help gain power by cleansing the city of criminals. This leads to the whole idea of his character, while the choice to make the main antagonist of this film a man who's half man, half Buddha statue, to be a very interesting one. This character works on a variety of levels. Something abundantly clear while watching is the focus on the prevailing nature of electricity, and the urbanization and increasing reliance on technology that comes with that. There are multiple shots that focus on the many power lines that are running through the environment, the background buzzing sounds of electricity. The film makes electricity inescapable, which is very much the case for our real lives as well, especially in a densely populated city like Tokyo. So due to the heavy reliance and ubiquity of electricity, the film juxtaposes this against Buddha as a way of saying, electricity is our new god. It outlines the ways in which humans praise electricity, including a scene where an older woman literally does pray to Thunderbolt Buddha. The use of Buddha in the film stands for more than just a comparison between technology and religion. Buddhism itself has some core tenets and elements that completely contradict how Thunderbolt Buddha acts in the film. This could be a whole video in and of itself, but to summarize, let's look at the 4 noble truths and how Thunderbolt Buddha contradicts these. The first is of dukkha, of human suffering. That is, that existence is characterized by human suffering, most of which comes from the idea that things are impermanent which humans cannot deal with. Ishii plays with this theme by making the character half human, half metallic being, making him somewhere between an impermanent human and a permanent statue, his whole existence being a contradiction. This also outlines a core theme of the movie about technology making people less human. We see this both in Dragon and Buddha. Dragon becoming more in tune with his animalistic reptilian instinct, and Buddha in his literal presentation of a man merging into metal. I wonder if this imagery was inspired by anything. The next 2 noble truths, Samudaya and Nirodha, focus on the origin of this suffering, that is, impermanence, and suggest that the only way to true nirvana or enlightenment is through ceasing human craving and attachment towards impermanent things. Again, this is in direct contradiction to Thunderbolt Buddha, who craves electricity, the symbol of technology and urbanism. This leads into Magga, or the truth of the path to the cessation of suffering, which essentially provides an 8-fold path for a Buddhist to follow to eliminate suffering from their life. This includes things like right speech, right action, and right mindfulness. I don't think I have to explain how this character doesn't follow any of these tenets. Thus, while on the first watch, the half-man, half-Buddha hybrid seems to be just a classic case of Japanese weirdness, it actually leans into some pretty important themes for the film. Both Buddha and Dragon cannot physically exist or have any power without this technology. This electricity that's painful and also killing them. This reliance on technology mirrors the way in which technology controls our own lives today. Ishii could see all this around him and channeled all this unrelenting anger, frustration, and rage about the futile effort of preventing this urbanism and greed into this film. The scene that demonstrates this best to me isn't even the insane fight sequence at the end, but shortly before this. Dragon returns home to see that Buddha has goaded him into a fight. This symbol of an all-religious, all-powerful electricity has destroyed his guitar and killed his lizards. Dragon reassembles his guitar, turns all the knobs on the amplifier to 11, and just unleashes. For a full 2-minute shot, uninterrupted, he just goes insane on the guitar. The distorted noises blare out of it as he throws it around, rips pieces off, uses the pieces he ripped off to hit the strings and create a brain-melting, headache-inducing mess. In this scene, Dragon is Ishii, a man so frustrated by the ways in which electricity has permeated every part of his life, all he can do is channel all of it into an angry, unrelenting art. This is when the film becomes what I would call feral. Electricity zaps from all angles, lights flicker and flash as the movie's hardcore soundtrack barrels through as they have their final confrontation on the Tokyo rooftops. In the end, the only way this almighty technology will end is when humans finally use it to destroy itself. Maybe then, humans will be able to break the shackles and escape from the hold that this new technology has on us. While many of the filmmakers in this video so far are certainly iconic or influential, there are none that I'll be discussing quite as prolific as Takashi Miike. With a director credit in over 100 movies, Miike pretty much has dabbled in any genre you can think of, and he's also combined almost every genre as well. I'll be honest, if it wasn't clear, I haven't watched all of Miike's movies. However, from what I have seen, a lot of his movies do seem to have a discernible plot, story, and idea that's translated well. However, I believe he has a couple of films worth noting that could be described as feral, some just for their presentation or insane ideas, some for how depraved and chaotic they are. It goes without saying that discussing Miike's films is like opening a can of worms. It should be stated though that Miike is known for his genre mashing, his insane ideas, and his depictions of ultra-violence. While I'm sure there are many films of his that would fit the bill for this discussion, the films we talk about will share common themes between previous entries in this video and those to come, linking them all together in a shared depravity and madness. In a similar vein to Obiyashi's House, The Happiness of the Katakuris employs similar techniques, blending special effects and live action with claymation to create a unique viewing experience. The film also feels like a fever dream, just like House, as it's both a zombie and musical film. The film focuses on a down-on-their-luck family who buy a house attempting to turn it into a tourist attraction. However, every visitor one by one ends up dying and piling up in their backyard, only to eventually seek revenge as zombies. The dreamlike quality of the film adds to the black humor, and the strange claymation sequences help to add to this bizarre feeling. Being a farce, the film's very overdramatic. While I wouldn't necessarily describe it as feral, the hilariously disturbing songs, sequences, and ideas leave an impression that adds to the uncanny feeling that the film is going for, making for an energetic and insane watch. This feeling of bizarre hilarity that's also somewhat disturbing can be said for a lot of Miike's work. Films like Visitor Q or Dead or Alive push these ideas even further, both being black comedies that are also violent at times, and even disturbing. Miike's distinct sensibilities in this regard have made his filmography one of the most intriguing from Japan, as a huge variety in subject matter and ideas are enough to cause emotional whiplash. Besides the film that helped jumpstart his career in America, Audition, one of the most notable films from Miike would be 2001's Ichi the Killer, a film that I think best encapsulates his style, how far he's willing to go, and the feral energy that is the discussion of this video. The film is hard to talk about for a video like this. Not only is it hard to show clips of due to the nature of the film, but the gruesome, vile scenes are disturbing to recount. There's assault, people getting ripped and torn, chopped in half, and mutilated. The film primarily follows a disgraced Yakuza member named Kakihara, a sadomasochist who enjoys brutalizing his victims as much as he enjoys being brutalized himself. As he searches for his boss who made off with his money, he meets Ichi, an equally disturbed man who is manipulated by a man named Gigi, who uses hypnosis to implant false memories in his head, enraging him and turning him into a violent and deadly assassin. There are a lot more plot details in this, but already you get the idea of the dark atmosphere atmosphere being built in the film. The film was adapted from a manga. While some of the ideas may not be entirely Miike's, the way in which the film shows these scenes is certainly from his warped mind. The film is relatively tame from a technical standpoint. When you compare it to films that we'll see later in this list, it presents a more or less clear story with competent shots that are clear when needed. However, this feral energy that exudes from the characters themselves definitely leaks into the filmmaking. Take, for example, the interesting opening scene and title sequence, or the various scenes of Ichi's false memories that are very compressed and overblown, illustrating the elusive, over-exaggerated nature of these memories. Funnily enough, I believe the most noteworthy thing about the film was not the gratuitous violence or interesting shot compositions, but the understated yet unhinged soundtrack. There are moments in which the music seems to be barely music, as various scratching sounds or industrial noises clang to mirror the lack of humanity and spirit in the world's universe. The film might not be truly as insane or chaotic as Electric Dragon or House in its presentation or concept, but it's hard to deny the adrenaline pumping action that drives the film. It may have a much more easy to follow story than previously mentioned movies, but achieves a similar goal through its disgusting nature and energy, seeming unhinged and feral. In the same way that part of the experience of watching House is to see what insane, mind-melting, creative and hilarious scene will happen next, Ichi keeps you on the edge, waiting to look away from the gut-turning violence, wondering how far it will go to disturb you. On a more broad scale, the film plays into the sexual degradation of humans and focuses on the dehumanization of the people in this environment. The violent killers don't see the people they kill as humans, but as prey to be taken. Both protagonists correlate eroticism with harming others and being harmed, and both take sexual pleasure from this aggression. Aggression is a common theme amongst many of Miike's films, something that he himself has stated.
Since childhood, I have had a complex about aggression. I never had enough nerve to punch someone that was horrible to me. This has stayed with me my whole life, and I believe this comes out in my films.
Miike uses his own repression of these emotions to fuel his films, which are over the top in their sexual deviancy, violence, and aggression. The film isn't an easy watch due to how disturbing it is. And of course, there's also the post-war implications that permeate most of the films in this list, about the dehumanization of people, them not mattering. It conveys all these things in an easy to understand way. But what if it didn't? What if there were another film that tackled these ideas of abuse, sexual perversion and repression, violence and harm towards other people, all portrayed in a way that was hard for the viewer to even understand? To step back into the cyberpunk realm, Ishii is not the only director in this category to play on themes of dehumanization through technology. As he was crafting his punk rock aesthetic in both costume and set, editing and music, another director from Japan was beginning to craft his own aesthetic as well. Where Ishii focused on imagery of counterculture, motorcycles, axes, and electric guitar, the feral nature of his work was more so an intense release of energy during key moments. For the films of Shozen Fuki, the focus was less on a focused rage and energy, and more about explorations of depravity, dehumanization, and performances from actors that cannot be categorized as anything other than feral. While the two vary in many, many ways, I also think there are some thematic and energetic similarities between Ichi the Killer and the film we're talking about next, that was released a decade before it, 964 Pinocchio. Through explaining the plot alone, the feral nature of the film and its themes of dehumanization and industrialism are obvious. Alright, it's a doozy. 964 Pinocchio, a lobotomized cyborg sex slave, is sent out to the streets of Japan when a lady who rents from him isn't happy with his ability to perform. From there, he's taken in by a homeless lady who turns out to be even more demented than the company that created him. The film revolves around these events and Pinocchio trying to escape all these people who want to hurt him. If it isn't clear from the description, there are definitely comparisons to be made here between this film and Ichi the Killer, in their overt focus on perversions and the correlation between power dynamics, abuse, and sexuality. Both this film and Ichi push sexual masochism to their extremes, but in different ways and to different ends. In Ichi, the correlation between sexuality and pain is integral to the story, playing into the stories of the various characters throughout. The film is extreme and intense, of course, but it's more or less competent in its presentation, giving a realized narrative about these perversions. 964 Pinocchio is not like this. In fact, the plot synopsis doesn't really help summarize what watching the movie is actually like. And while there is some nudity and sexuality at times, it's as if this sexual frustration and tension all comes through in the filmmaking and presentation, the formal elements, rather than the narrative. By nature of what the film's about, themes of sexuality and power of course play a role, but it isn't overtly clear in its dialogue and presentation about these themes as Ichi is. This is when the feral nature of the films we will be discussing begins to take a front seat, as the films become much more chaotic and esoteric all at once. The film takes a lot of imagery discussed so far in this video, the rebellious and abusive nature of Sun Tribe, the brain-bending imagery and cinematography of Obayashi, the overly technological imagery of Ishii, and pushes them to a disgusting maximum. There's torture, there's close-ups of contorted faces screaming, there's vomit, like a lot of vomit. Scenes transition abruptly to the point where sometimes it's hard to tell what's even happening. When I sat down to watch this film, I had seen various clips online of the main character, Pinocchio, running around screaming in the streets of Tokyo. I expected the film to kind of build this tension and then release, kind of like previous films we've discussed so far. What I didn't expect was for his strange-looking, horrific acting performance to be outdone by a young actress who was originally just a crew member on the film and never acted in anything else ever again. Just look at the facial expressions and deranged performance from this actress, but also look at the reactions to those around her. This is where one of the most significant things about the movie comes into play. The fact that much of it was filmed guerrilla style.
分かったんですけど、それでもやるにはゲリラしかないなっていうのがあって、あ、こういう手あるじゃんとかと思う。
As Fuki puts it in an interview released with the DVD version of the film, it was a low-budget effort. They didn't have money to rent a studio, to get permits they wanted, or to splurge on extras and such. Thus, a lot of the scenes, especially those filmed in the subway or city, were filmed as real people just walked around, carrying on about their day. This adds an extra layer of uncanny to the characters, as they're directly compared to the regular people around them. It also further dehumanizes them, separating them from the majority of people around them. People in the background avoid them, stare at them, give them weird looks. Getting the real visceral reaction from people plays into the isolation both of these characters feel. 964 Pinocchio as a cyborg sex slave, and Himiko as a homeless person. As other films in this genre do, and another way that the guerrilla filmmaking adds to the feral nature of the film is that the camera moves in interesting ways. It shakes around, again due to the way that the movie had to be filmed, but the handheld feel also adds a layer of anxiety and unease to the whole movie. Take this scene, for example, in which the camera films at a bizarre angle at the back of the head. The character makes strange noises and shakes around like he's losing all sense of reality. While it may be hard to really understand what's happening or why, the intense stylistic choices have no choice but to bury themselves in your brain, haunting you. The film makes an interesting statement about power dynamics and the trickle-down effects of oppression. Himiko has had her memory erased as well, and as a homeless person, has very little power or status in society. When she comes across Pinocchio, she meets someone who has even less status in society than her. However, while Himiko still has control over her own body, it isn't long until she realizes that she can oppress others in the way she herself has been oppressed. The film ends when both of them come to this realization about their communal loneliness, which brings them together in this unintelligible final scene. According to Fuki himself, the whole sequence is meant to represent the consciousness of Himiko and Pinocchio coming together.
全然言うつもりもないので、はっきり一つのものが一つになって融合したっていうことを表現したかったと。で、ピノキオとヒミコが2つともが破壊されちゃうんですよね、肉体はね。でも2人の意識とかこうだけども、意識としては非常に2人は。
He's intentionally vague about what that actually means, but I think it plays into the idea of the characters being oppressed by the industry around them, and their lack of power in it. They may both be deranged and depraved, they may both be oppressed social outcasts with penchants for chaos and destruction, but they're the same in their struggle against the oppression and most people in society who just ogle at them. And that creates this monstrosity, this ugly but happy mutual consciousness or understanding of one another. The film does everything in its power to convince you not to watch it, that it's too dirty or grotesque to be considered art. However, as we've seen through the various examples so far, this fact in and of itself helps to bolster the film's own ideology. By continuing this tradition of films that challenge audiences and use unbridled chaos, untethered by humanity, as an extension of the frustrations they felt with the world around them, they play into a long tradition of cinema that has done the same, pushing boundaries and audiences alike. In this way, the cinematic display of ferality uses the kinesis of cinema to further push its own themes. Yes, you can capture that kinetic energy in a song, many songs in these movies do, or in a painting, creating chaotic strokes. However, by applying a formalist lens to these films, it is evident that the ways that cinema can use both of these senses and then juxtapose them against one another, or jump between these visual or auditory images, creates a unique energy that, in my opinion, does an excellent job of illustrating this ferality that this video is about. And yes, I just wrote all that about a movie where a woman rolls around in the subway covered in vomit for like 10 minutes. Fuki would go on to make more cyberpunk industrial noise-inspired films, including Rubber's Lover, which is functionally a prequel movie set in the same universe as Pinocchio, establishing himself as a true staple of cyberpunk aesthetic and imagery taken to its most extreme form. As you could guess, many people who watch a film like 964 Pinocchio struggle to finish it, or when they do, they're thrown off by its presentation, chaos, sexualized, dehumanized nature. I mean, I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, okay, he said he's going to discuss these films on a scale, getting more unhinged as they go. Surely this is the end of the scale. Surely it doesn't get any more deranged than this, right? It's 2001. You just got back from the corner store with a copy of PlayStation World magazine. Like most kids probably did, you open the plastic wrap, put the magazine to the side, and pop the included DVD with special features in your PS2. You begin watching the trailers for games, featurettes, clips from TV shows, but then while browsing, you notice a blank spot on one of the menus. A circle appears when you navigate to it, but no title. Out of curiosity, you click it, and then this happens. This film doesn't seem to be new. It looks old. What is this film? And what's it about? If you've been enjoying what you've seen so far and you're into insane, disturbing, gritty, bloody, cyberpunk, migraine-inducing, completely baffling cinema, then let me introduce you to Shinya Tsukamoto. And no, nobody really knows why this was accidentally on a PlayStation Magazine DVD, but it was for some reason. Go watch a video about it. For my money, Tsukamoto is the king when it comes to feral filmmaking, which is why I saved the discussion of him for the end. The editing style, special effects, confusing scene structure, they all work together to create something that's legitimately migraine-inducing, but in the best way possible. I'm of course talking about 1989's Tetsuo the Iron Man. Like the films of Ishii and Fuki, Tsukamoto covers similar themes focusing on industrialism, urbanism, and the dehumanization of this process. His approach is slightly different, as instead of making a film in which the characters are impacted by or can harness the powers of industrialism, he made a monster film, a staple of the horror tradition, in which a man literally becomes this industrialism, a man made of metal and iron. Trying to summarize the plot of this movie is challenging because the film is frankly hard to follow. It doesn't necessarily show events to the watcher in order or in a way that translates easily to understand what's happening, or explain to the viewer in any way what is going on. Similar to the films that came after it, like 964 Pinocchio, the film takes a more loose approach to this narrative structure, showing the various pieces of the story and letting the viewer come to an understanding themselves. Honestly, I'll do my best to explain what's happening, but I would thoroughly suggest pausing and going to watch the movie yourself and then coming back. It's only 67 minutes long. Okay, did you do it? If you did, now you can understand what I'm getting at. The film was about a Japanese businessman who gets into a hit-and-run accident with a young man who's a metal fetishist, meaning he likes to stick metal in his arms and legs. The businessman and his girlfriend throw his body in the woods and make love nearby it. However, they don't realize that this metal fetishist seems to be immortal, as it's later revealed that he has had metal grow in his head and is still alive. So the young metal fetishist begins to use his relationship with metal to manipulate metal to do what he wants and torment the couple who killed him, slowly turning the businessman into metal. This involves the man being chased by a metal woman hybrid and turning the man's penis into a giant drill. The man loses control of the drill and kills his girlfriend with it, turning further and further into an iron nightmare. Eventually, the young man tells him he's going to come find them, and they battle in the streets, turning everything in their path into metal. The businessman, who is now fully turned into the Iron Man, overpowers the young man in a fight and realizes that now they're both fully made of metal, that they can turn the whole world into metal as they merge into one big giant metal monster and ram through the streets. When people describe a movie by saying something like you need to watch it for yourself or needs to be seen to be believed, they usually mean it's either absolutely insane or absolutely amazing and spectacular. Most movies, even ones that people describe in this way, can be described or summarized. Even the most challenging movies on this list so far far, like Pinocchio or Electric Dragon or House, follow a basic story that's translated through watching the movie. However, I legitimately think what separates Tetsuo apart is the lack of a solid structure. I truly think the only way to describe this movie to someone is to have them watch it themselves. And this leads into why I think this film truly embodies the idea of feral filmmaking. Not to be this person, but let's look at the definition for feral. Feral refers to an animal that is not domesticated or cultivated, or as having escaped from domestication and become wild. When applying this definition to Tetsuo, it becomes clear why the film could be described this way. The film was totally free from any convention in filmmaking or storytelling, especially by 1989. It's shot on black and white 16mm film. It cuts dramatically between scenes, jumping from a seemingly normal moment to a moment in which the viewer isn't sure what's even going on. Most importantly, it's a film which thrives and survives on the formal elements of it alone. I would argue that if you were to see the same story being told by a different director, using more traditional methods of editing and storytelling, and falling in line with other monster genre movies of the time, the movie may still be good, but it wouldn't even be remotely as interesting. Tetsuo was a film where the way in which the film is made and presents its subject matter is actually more interesting than the characters or story being told. And I think that's how it best embodies the idea of being feral. It survives on raw, uncompromised energy. It is completely broken free of the domestication of years of tradition of cinematic storytelling and channels all this anger and horror and rage and chaos into the editing. It's as if you can feel Tsukamoto angrily chopping up the film with a butcher knife, or True Ishikawa absolutely demolishing a piece of metal in his garage for the soundtrack. It's a truly visceral viewing experience that few movies, even others on this list, have matched. The creative ways that the film is shot further demonstrate the film's thesis. Well, if the film really has a thesis. It doesn't have a thesis so much as a bunch of suggestions about industrialism and urbanization in Japan, with similar themes of Electric Dragon. But these themes come through in a number of interesting choices that, on the surface, seem to just add to the aesthetic of the film. Take, for example, the various scenes that seem to be filmed by the camera filming a television or screen. These moments seem to be from the point of view of the metal fetishist who's slowly becoming metal. His memories and his sight seem to be taken over, making it look like everything he remembers has been recorded on the television screen. This, of course, adds an aesthetic layer to the film, but it also plays into the film's themes about humans becoming the technology that they rely on.
自分が映画を作る前は、僕が映画で使ってるのはそのテクノロジー音がテーマ。
While the music used in other films on this list have been phenomenal, perhaps more than any other film on this list does the music enhance the experience than in Tetsuo. The industrialized sounds, which legitimately sound like nails being hammered and metal sheets being produced at times, would put Nine Inch Nails to shame. Industry and metal permeate every element of this film: the imagery, the plot, and even the soundtrack. While the film may not be the easiest to follow or understand, the vision and intent is clear. As most movies we've discussed thus far, sexuality plays a big role in this film as well. The typical Japanese businessman and his callous disregard for the young man he hits with his car illustrates the correlation between the industrialization and dehumanization. If that wasn't bad enough, the businessman has sex shortly after this incident. However, Tsukamoto takes this even further when, as discussed, the businessman's genitalia is mutated into a giant drill. A humorous and emphatic visual image that also illustrates the infiltration of industrialization on every part of Japanese life, from work and business to love and sex. The erotic imagery receives another added layer close to the end of the film. It's important to note that the young man is a metal fetishist, which is established early in the film, which creates this dichotomy between eroticism and industrialism. So when the two metal men decide to merge into one, the film takes this opportunity for a brief moment of reprieve and a moment of beauty amongst all the clutter. We see these two men, both shirtless, who are floating within a big pile of metal and wires. Their hands have been merged together, and for a moment, the music is jazzy and sensual rather than intense. For the metal fetishist, this is the ultimate conclusion for him, as his body literally merges with the metal, and he shares his experience with another person. It's no surprise that when they do merge, their bodies take on a rather interesting shape. Thus, it becomes clear that, from the point of view of the young man, this has never been a horrific monster story, but a love story. Ultimately, I think this film is the perfect embodiment of feral filmmaking because to me, it's the most effective in this end. It's short, intense, angry, and untethered to cinematic norms. It's like an intense punk rock song about fears for the future and anger and sexual frustration, all vomited out at you at warp speed. It's successful in getting this point across in the most intense and chaotic way possible. Tsukamoto has a long list of films that are simply depraved and deranged, including 2 sequels to this film. However, Tetsuo holds a special place to me due to it being Tsukamoto's first feature film. He didn't have a name for himself yet, he had barely a budget, and he himself played the businessman in the film. He took a complete gamble on this absolute batshit insane film with no guarantee that it would ever come to anything. Yet it's gone on to inspire countless filmmakers, many of which were featured in this video. To bring it all back to where this discussion started, with the Sun Tribe films of the 60s, I think Tetsuo is a natural growth, or should I say mutation, of this genre. It embodies the same spirit as those films about making a grand statement about the dirty underground of Japanese society, and bottles up all the frantic energy, music, and ideas from films like the Warp ones, and dials everything up to 11. In this way, I find Tsukamoto to be the perfect benchmark in this weird world of Japanese cinema, both clearly inspired by the work that came before him and highly influential to the work that came afterwards. Even if you watch the movie and don't enjoy it, which I wouldn't blame you, it's hard to deny the personality that would inflict upon other movies, and also respect it as a movie that pushed the medium of cinema forward. Ultimately, even though all these films can carry vastly different ideas and themes, the importance of this so-called feral filmmaking is the way in which creative filmmakers use the movie medium to push cinema forward. This is how creativity and originality stay alive in cinema. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you may have been able to pick up on the fact that these ideas about creativity are super important to me. Some of the films in this list today I didn't even enjoy, which you'd know if you follow me on Letterboxd, just saying. But they're so creative and original that I can't help but be impressed by them in some regard, and believe that this is a spirit that pushes the medium in new and interesting ways. It's really easy to fall into this trap of thinking that cinema is dead, as we become inundated with remake after remake, franchise films spanning years and years, the same few celebrity faces over and over again. However, if there's one thing that's significant about cinema today, is that the underground is dead. Through sites like YouTube, through discussion boards and forums, it's easier than ever for filmmakers to create and spread their films to willing audiences who are looking for something different. And because of the internet, they're able to do these things in new and creative ways that hadn't existed before. Not only that, but the films that we're talking about today would be very hard to find, impossible even, if it wasn't due to dedicated people who've taken the time to appreciate these films and archive them, so new audiences can be amazed and inspired by them. When films do something new, it can be exciting, even if the results don't work for you. I think these feral films can introduce people to an exhilarating, intense viewing experience that confuses, confounds, and perfectly encapsulates the overstimulation of living the way that we do now. At the very least, they can entertain in an engaging way. At the beginning of this video, I asked a very simple question. What is feral filmmaking? Well, at its core, it just refers to films that use formal elements of filmmaking to express intense and chaotic emotion. There are numerous examples from various countries from various times. However, for the purpose of this video, we use Japan as a grounding point, as their long-held traditions of Sun Tribe films, of films that went against the grain of society, ingrained in post-war anxiety and rage, seem to be the perfect starting point and segue into the feral films that would come from the country over the years. Sometimes it's nice to find a movie that illustrates exactly what you're finding hard to do, that screams when you're quiet, that explodes for you when you can't. That's the magic of feral filmmaking. Thanks for watching. Take it easy. All right, really quick, I just wanted to pop on here and say thank you to anybody who's watching. I realized that this week is my 3-year anniversary of being on YouTube, and I never expected to ever get any kind of audience. So if you're new to watching, new to the channel, thank you so much for being here. If you've been watching for a while now, thank you again for your continued support. I never really ever expected to be able to share my stupid little thoughts on things with random strangers on the internet, but here we are. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.